Good morning and welcome back for our second conversation at the University of Richmond Wyatt T. Walker Symposium, the Wyatt T. Walker and the Politics of Black Religion. Our second conversation is on the theme Democratic Faith of Black Religion. Before we begin, I want to remind you that we're using the hashtag URWTW2020 throughout the symposium. So if you have a picture or a statement or quote, we'd love for you to use that hashtag URWTW2020. And now I'd like to welcome up my dear colleague from the Department of Political Science, Professor Ernest B. McGowen III, who will moderate this conversation. Ernest.
All right, thank you all for being here. So the format is that we're going to have presentations by the panelists. One of our panelists is currently en route, so once he arrives, I'm sure he'll just come up and present, and I will introduce him when he comes. So we have two distinguished guests who I'm very excited about to hear what they have to say. The first is James Manigault-Bryant. He is a professor of Africana Studies at Williams College, where he teaches courses on the secularization of African American religious life, the intellectual histories of Black studies and sociology, and the environmental degradation of Black inhabited spaces. Manigault-Bryant has published essays in the CLR James Journal, the Antigua and Barbuda Review of Books, Critical Psychology, Race and Yoga, and the Journal of Africana Religions. One thing that's not on the bio is that he was recently promoted to full professor at Williams College, one of our hopeful peers one day. The other thing not on the bio, he joined Twitter in January. So it is at OKOYE Soldier, so give him a follow, if you will. All right. Next to him, we have Reverend Richard Wills. He's the senior pastor of Friendship Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. He's been professionally active as an architect, educator, and minister. His publications include Reflections on Our Pastor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, 1954 through 1960, co-authored with Wally Vaughn, and another book, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Image of God from Oxford Press. His forthcoming book, The Pastor King, is to be published by a Big Don Press. One thing not in his bio, he is only the 7th pastor in the 158-year history of his church. Another thing, if you are a procrastinator like me, check out his sermon, The Urgency of Now, based on Solomon and Ecclesiastes, and his tag is just plant something. Just plant something. Don't wait until the situation is absolutely perfect. Just go and do it. All right. So is there, one of you want to go first? Or?
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Manigault-Bryant.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
The irony of my having just joined Twitter is that my wife, Ron, just spoke to you about the importance of curating oneself through various forms of media, and my approach to that has been to not, it's been to avoid a lot of it. So, but I'm catching up. Movement and stillness, provocations for considering Dr. Wyatt T. Walker's sermonic photography. In the second segment of the two-part interview Joseph Evans conducted with Dr. Wyatt T. Walker and Mrs. Teresa Ann Walker in 2016, Professor Evans asked Dr. Walker to offer his impressions of several prominent individuals, including Malcolm X, Al Sharpton, and Angela Davis, all for whom he gave very candid and at times brutally candid opinions. At the end of his list of well-known figures, Professor Evans then asked Dr. Walker if he recalled a cameraman for CBS who was not a celebrity, and for whom Professor Evans perhaps did not expect Dr. Walker to recall. Dr. Walker was, after all, then approaching the age of 88. But Dr. Walker responded rather quickly that he remembered this man, quote, very well. Clearly surprised at the power of Dr. Walker's recall, although he should not have been at this point in the interview, since Dr. Walker had been able to remember details upon details of his life. Professor Evans diverged briefly from his script of questions to ask, quote, Dr. Walker, has anybody ever told you that you have a memory like a photographic memory? And Dr. Walker responded, I have heard that. It is curious to me how Dr. Walker, who possessed such a gifted faculty of memory of events, people, and text, used photography. The Walker collection here at the University of Richmond has, I have heard, anywhere between 1,200 and 1,500 pictures, 600 of which are currently available for viewing. The sheer number of images suggests the centrality of photography to Dr. Walker's overall practice as a cultural historian and as an archiver of himself. The photos are of his journeys across the globe to Spain, Africa, Mexico, India, the Holy Land, for example, but also of his time with family at birthday parties and on vacations. Photographs of his travels vary in their emphases. For example, his visits to Africa capture landscapes and art objects like wooden sculptures, while his trips to India were mostly of people going about their daily lives, on rickshaws and at rivers washing their clothes. The mere expanse of photography that Dr. Walker took, for me, begs the question, how does someone endowed with such a remarkable gift of detailed memory determine what to capture in stillness? For my remarks today, I want to consider the collection of 61 photographs of the 1966 March Against Fear in the state of Mississippi, which began on Sunday, June 5th, 1966, when James Meredith embarked on a 220-mile walk across Mississippi to contest the fear held among Black Mississippians when they tried to register to vote. Meredith, by then widely known for his efforts to integrate the University of Mississippi, in 1962, began walking, by some accounts by himself, from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi on Highway 51. On the second day of his protest, on June 6th, Meredith was struck by 3 loads of buckshot fired upon him by a white man named Aubrey James. Leaders from CORE, SNCC, and SCLC went to Meredith's aid, organizing the march. While there was tension among the organizers, or tensions among the organizations over the direction of the march, which routes it should take, it eventually turned from Highway 51 towards the heart of the Delta region, where it mobilized numbers reaching around 15,000 marchers by the time it returned to Highway 51 into Jackson, Mississippi. The 1966 Fear March has been the subject of a number of photographic books and exhibits. The famed photographer of the civil rights movement, Maria Varela, was commissioned to take pictures of the demonstration, her first such assignment. And Jack Thornwell's photo of Meredith, moments after he was shot, has become an iconic image in civil rights history. It's been a focal point. At the time, it was a focal point of national conversation about the inevitability of integration and white fears of Blacks occupying white spaces. Photographic histories of the civil rights movement tend to emphasize the climax of confrontation, But the images of Dr. Walker's collection from this same event do something quite distinct. They show one day in the course of this demonstration, from sunup to sundown. While the photographs are undated but because they include Meredith, who rejoined the march after healing. He rejoined it the day before it concluded on June 26th. I suspect that the day that Dr. Walker took these images was probably June 25th. The photographs sequenced the day from a series of angles at ground level and from an elevated standing. This day, it seems, did not result in violence or in the loss of lives, yet the ever-present threat of brutality haunt the photos. Many basic questions about the photographs remain unanswered, like, what kind of camera did Dr. Walker use? How did he achieve some of the positions he reached to take some of the pictures? And how did he intend the photographs to be used? Nonetheless, these questions aside, the photographs memorialize the faces of devoted demonstrators and denote the size of the march. In my estimation, there are three categories of pictures in this carousel of images. One, the organizers. This is James Meredith. We have James Meredith next to Dr. King. And here we have an image of Dr. Walker to Dr. King's right, and I haven't been able to identify the person to his left. If there's someone here who might know who that is, I would certainly welcome knowledge of that. So this is one category of images among these 61. The second category of images I would just call surveillance. There are a few pictures that Dr. Walker took of police officers who were trailing along, both behind and besides the marchers, the demonstrators. And so we have this one that was during the day, and then it looks like this shot was taken from a car at night. So this was near the end of the march. And then the third category, and I'm going to spend my remaining time talking about this third category of images. They're of the demonstrators themselves. They're of groups of demonstrators at different moments along Highway 51 in Jackson. So the first image I want to think about, or want us to think about, it's number 3906. It shows approximately 150 people in this frame, and it's taken from an elevated position. I don't know how Dr. Walker got. I don't know what he's sitting on, what he's standing on at the time that he's taken this, but this is a part of a future search. But there were 13 images taken from this position. So it was clearly important for him to capture the protesters from this angle. And maybe they were taken in succession to try to capture all of the protesters in their entirety. But in this particular photograph, you see a mix of races, people of different races and ages, and the focus is on those in the line that are closest to the camera. You see their clothes, a red polo here, a white blouse or t-shirt there, creating a tapestry of color. You also see the elongated shadows from their bodies hitting the asphalt of the highway to the right. Two automobiles, a black truck on the right and a white sedan on the left, mark the group in the photo in half. And you see a family of spectators right behind the car on the left-hand side. From another angle, and this is taken from the rear of a group of the protesters, the focus appears to be on the white man in the left corner here in the white fedora and white shirt, and in front of him you see a white woman in a green floral print dress carrying a knapsack, and slightly to her right is a black man also wearing a fedora who looks off to the right, perhaps at the Highway 51 sign or the grass surrounding it, which are more clearly into view. But everything else in the image is blurry. The mass of protesters, the billboard to the right, there's a billboard to the right of the image in the back, the utility poles in the distant, all of those are quite blurry. The third image, this is one of 8 shots that were taken from the same position, from behind a highway sign, and I don't know what's on the other side of that sign. That would be really telling for where they were along Highway 51 at this particular point during the demonstration. But the faces of the demonstrators are more clearly identifiable, including James Meredith, who is in the first line, third from the left. The protesters seem to be following a car, the tail of which peeks out from the right side of the photograph. The image has a mood. Even if I did not have external information suggesting that this was the final stretch of the march, there is a sense that it is nearing a conclusion. There's a sense of triumph that undergirds the photo, like the protesters are almost floating towards the end. This is because, in contrast to the previous 2 images I showed you, the viewer can more clearly see the walking strides of the protesters. Some legs are lifted, some are not. Arms are in different positions along their bodies. Now, I'm wondering whether Dr. Walker's interest in capturing from multiple angles the size of the march was more than just memorializing the success of the numbers, which grew to almost 15,000 by the time it had reached this point in Jackson. Another moment from the Joseph Evans interview that I began my remarks with has me thinking about this from a slightly different angle. Dr. Walker organized Dr. King's homegoing service in 1968. He was determined to make the ceremony a state funeral by the attire of the pallbearers and the officiants, and by organizing a procession from Ebenezer Baptist Church to Morehouse College. Dr. Walker explained in the interview. He said, and we arranged for 100,000 people to come, and about 400,000 came. And what I did, I measured the streets and how many people could walk abreast of each other, and timed how long it would take to walk from Ebenezer to Morehouse College. And I feel like it was one of the capstones of my organizational career. Professor Evans observed that the funeral dirge, quote, looked like a final protest movement, with his casket going down wherever the street was. It looked like you all were actually marching again in protest, close quote. I'm intrigued by the connection Professor Evans draws between protest marches and processions for religious services, and how it might have informed Dr. Walker's approach to photography, at least of this demonstration. So I'm wondering, was Dr. Walker collecting information for future demonstrations? Was he archiving the march for his own personal use? How do the images for this demonstration compare to those of others he might have photographed? Or was he collecting images of a procession, which is part of Black church rituals, much like he collected music? On this occasion, we might consider the synergetic relationship among Dr. Walker's sermons, his histories of Black music, his films and his photographic productions as creating a multimedia account of the Black past, a story usable for reconstituting our democratic faith. The volume of photographs in his collection, suggests they too are integral to a stylistic mode of remembering and beckon for his placement with respect to numerous other models of photographic making across the Black diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and to Dr. McGowen, thank you for setting the tone for our conversation this afternoon. I certainly want to express my appreciation to Dr. Walker for including us in this conversation and for sitting on my doctoral committee at the University of Virginia. I feel at home at the University of Richmond. It was Dr. Frank Egan, who I believe was Dean of the Religious Studies Department here at the University of Richmond, who encouraged me to pursue my studies at the University of Virginia. I understand he passed 2 weeks ago. And just wanted to lift his name as we have this very important conversation today around this iconic figure, Dr. Wyatt T. Walker. Let me begin my brief presentation around Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, a race man building the beloved community. Let me couch it in a personal experience I had with him. It's not noted in the bulletin, but we had the wonderful privilege of serving as his assistant for some 4 years in Harlem on 116th Street. I was pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. My wife and I and family lived in the parsonage on Jackson Street, and it was in an attempt to reinstitute a lecture that Dr. King commenced in April of 1955 as the new pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. In an attempt to reinstitute that, we invited Dr. Walker to Montgomery to help launch our efforts around the lectureship. It was at that time that Dr. Walker invited me to New York to serve as his assistant. And you can just imagine what that might have looked like to relocate from Montgomery, Alabama to Harlem, New York, the town that Wyatt used to say was so fabulous they had to name it twice. New York, New York. By default, we served on the board of the National Action Network that is led by Al Sharpton, and I remember sitting in the office with Wyatt T. Walker and Al as they were organizing a board for the National Action Network, wanting to move beyond the city of New York and network across the nation. And as they had this conversation about the configuration of their board, I thought it would be appropriate as his new assistant to make a suggestion. I suggested that the board take on the demographics of the city, and that they include individuals of Latino and Caucasian background. I thought that their voices would be valued as they expanded their efforts. And it was at that point that Dr. Walker and Al Sharpton looked at me like I had fallen off of Pluto. Their silence caught me off guard. I mean, we relocated from Montgomery, right? Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the beloved community, the March on Washington. But they quickly reminded me that I was no longer in Montgomery, that I was in Harlem, 1996 on 116th Street, incidentally just down the street from Mosque number 7 that was headquartered by Malcolm X. And it was Wyatt T. Walker and Al Sharpton who informed me that while that may have been an interesting suggestion, Richard, we are Black nationalists. And this work is a work for us, by us. I resumed my place and kind of observed the balance of the afternoon. I discovered that Wyatt kind of prided himself upon this idea of being what he called a race man, a race man. Dr. Richard Lisher, homiletician at Duke University, helps us understand. He coins a definition for us in his 1997 publication of The Preacher King. And he defines what a race man is this way, and I quote, "A race man is one who translated congregational and charismatic power into political clout for the sake of his or her race." It was Wyatt T. Walker, one who translated congregational and charismatic power into political clout for the sake of his race. And it is interesting that it was not necessarily Vernon Johns. We're grateful for our colleagues who presented earlier. It's not necessarily Vernon Johns, nor Adam Clayton Powell, or W. Du Bois, or Howard Thurman, Sam Proctor, some of these others who inspired and influenced his positioning around the need to be this race man, but actually his father. It was his father and the raw material of his childhood experience that shaped and informed this lifelong, passionate pursuit of justice and racial equality. Before Dr. Walker ventures to seminary at Virginia Union, it's the towering influence of his dad, the preacher, the pastor, that informed and orients his theopolitical vision and activism. Wyatt was raised on the front row of a church pew, a Black church pew, and we would have conversations about his childhood. He reminded me often that he grew up with vivid recollections of it was called Shady Grove Baptist Church. Which was one of 3 modest congregations located in Merchantville, New Jersey, southern New Jersey. I checked, the town has a booming population currently, well, this was in 2010, of all of 3,821 residents. You can imagine what the population was during his childhood. But it was that modest congregation with his father's preachment of a social gospel, the choir's songs of Zion, the deacon's prayers, and the congregation's lively call and response that most influenced Dr. Walker during those formative years. In fact, we see Wyatt's early inclinations toward this tendency to become a race man. He was actually a race boy or a race young man. It was at the age of 9, if you can imagine Wyatt at the age of 9, it is at the age of 9 that he first staged his civil rights protest when he and his siblings attempted to go to a segregated movie theater. They attempted to turn him away. He refused to be turned away at the age of 9 and marched he and his siblings into the theater to enjoy that movie. At the age of 9, here he is protesting. We see that thread and theme continued as he assumes the pastorate at Gilfield Baptist Church in Petersburg. This is prior to his years with King at SCLC in Atlanta. It is Walker, the pastor now, who in 1953, months into his pastorate, you know, most pastors have the, kind of the courtesy, the wisdom, whatever, to give their tenure 24 to 36 months before doing anything radical or revolutionary. And here is Wyatt, months into his new pastorate, Gilfield Baptist Church in Petersburg, protesting, this segregated library and insisting that blacks ought to have access to the library. He goes into the library, and of all books, he attempts to check out Douglas Southall Freeman's biography of Robert E. Lee. For Dr. Walker, of course, Birmingham, the campaign C is kind of the quintessential, the classic culmination of his work, and all of which speaks to the fact, and he would say so often, that the leading problem, at least for him then, and as he approached retirement, the leading problem in America was not its economy or some of the other political issues. The leading problem in Dr. Wyatt T. Walker's mind in America and the formation of a pure democracy was and is the problem of race and racism. And so how does he translate, how does he attempt to translate then this congregational and charismatic power into political clout for the sake of his race? He does so through the agency of the church, and he does so in an attempt to create an economic base for the black community. The framework out of which he operates, which I thought was interesting, he would often refer to Luke chapter 4 and verse 18. Some of us are familiar with that passage. Jesus is in the temple and he's quoting from the book of Isaiah in the company of the Pharisees and the religious leaders. And it is this passage that becomes kind of the driving impetus, the theological framework out of which he operates. It reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free." Walker stated on numerous occasions as we met and sat together, as we broke bread in press conferences and through sermonic presentation, he would often say that we are in the worse shape now than we were 40 years ago, and the church must prepare now for the social crisis that we shall face in the years to come. Incidentally, when interviewed by Robert P. Wen in his book entitled Who Speaks for the Negro, Dr. Walker was of the mind that there would be the need for these race men and women and this inclination, tendency toward black nationalism for the next, what he said would be the five to six generations. And it would be in that period of time, his hope was that we would arrive at a place that would begin to look much more like the beloved community. Until that juncture in the journey, he was of the mind, again, that it was the church that should be the primary cultivator of this economic development. For those of you who have read his publication entitled The Harvard Papers, you will see him as he engages in these lectures at Harvard University and attempts to press the claim of the church in that regard. It is the church that leverages the economic clout of the community via the agency of its institution. And I must say, Wyatt was fierce in terms of his protection of the church in Harlem. The congregation sat about 2,300 parishioners, and for him it was Sunday morning. That was the opportunity to reach its projected budget for the year, and there were a number of tourists that would line up on 116th Street to occupy the congregation. Dr. Walker was of the mind that the tourists were displacing his tithing members. And in deacon board meetings would have conversations about how they circumvent that and assure that his parishioners would have priority in terms of the seats. And so he would line the tourists up and assure that they would not be allowed to enter the congregation until his parishioners had an opportunity to be seated. And when they did arrive, they were seated in the balcony of the congregation. They had a tendency to want to to leave midway of the service, and in his mind, they didn't tithe. They rarely left an offering. And so it made perfect sense to him. Many of his parishioners were commuters, and so he worked in arrangement with the local police department so that they could double park and also have an opportunity to worship. When they were ticketed, he was livid and would protest police stations to assure that they would end what for him was an harassment of his parishioners, which represented his economic base as well. It is interesting in this photograph that we're seeing, Wyatt is not protesting Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's egregious policies in Harlem. This is early on in his pastorate at Canaan Baptist Church, and he's actually organizing the community to rally against drug dealers that had occupied 116th Street. He was celebrated the fact that he cleaned up Harlem after he took on the pastorate at Canaan Baptist Church, and here he is rallying the community against drug dealers and crack houses on 116th Street and prostitution rings that were common just down the street from where he pastored. And so for him, it was a matter of stabilizing the community and then moving out of that interior place to address racism and the other factors that created dysfunction in his community. Among the ministries that he supported and pushed were those around fair and affordable housing in Harlem. He and other pastors organized a housing coalition that attempted to gain housing for those who were residents in Harlem. They had ministries around senior housing. At Canaan, they had a credit union that offered funding for loans for parishioners in ways that they could not perhaps secure a conventional loan at the local bank. And I think for Wyatt, one of his crowning projects and efforts was around the school, the Sisulu Charter School, that was completed in 1999. We were privileged to be a part of that construction project. I think initially he intended that be a community center, and as we moved through this $3.5 million project and we began to examine the budget, there were some constraints there, and we wondered how we would float the loan when it was converted from a construction loan to a conventional mortgage. And it was interesting, the funding did not come from Wesley Snipes or Oprah, but a white philanthropist who was interested in identifying property in Harlem for a charter school. And so providentially, he was able to work out an arrangement that funded the school and furthered this wonderful project. I think it was one of the first charter schools in the state of New York, one of three, the only one that continues to exist and serve the community to this day. Dr. Walker shared kind of the sentiment of individuals like E. Franklin Frazier in his book, The Negro Church in America, who was of the mind that the church represented somehow a nation within the nation and provided the kind of sustainability for a better, so-called brighter future. For me, and I'll close with this thought, the tension as I considered our work with Dr. Walker and this idea of how do you get from being a race man and a black nationalist to the beloved community? How do you resolve that kind of creative tension and move to a place of mutual regard and coexistence? And I must say, as we raise that question, why it would often remind me, Richard, I'm not anti-white, I'm just pro-black. And so I guess that for him, at least intellectually and socially and theologically, provided, kind of this avenue toward the possibility of beloved community in a pluralistic capitalist democracy. For him, beloved community did look like mutual regard, but mutual regard primarily in the area of economic equity. It is interesting, in September of 2015, Walker wrote an essay for Real Clear Politics along with Steve Klinsky, who was the investor for the charter school. And in this essay, Walker and Klinsky called for a fundamental respect for all people, considered all individuals without regards to the race, and expressed opposition to theories such as critical race theories that classified people primarily as members of racial groups. Dr. Walker was a complicated yet colorful individual, and I must say again how grateful I am for those of you who are present and for this conversation to help us kind of unpack and understand this incredible, towering, iconic figure that Jesse Jackson often referred to as the Renaissance preacher of Harlem. Thank you.
For those of you uninitiated, when the pastor says he's coming to a close, there's a close, and then there's a close, and then there's a close. So that was, all right. So Dr. Ravi Perry is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Howard University. If you think you notice him, it's because he used to be here at VCU, used to be on television doing the political stuff. He's an expert in black politics, minority representation, urban politics, American political policy, and LGBT candidates of color. He's the editor of 21st Century Urban Politics, Representing Minorities as Universal Interests, a book that discusses the efforts of African American, Latino, and Asian mayors to represent the interests of minorities in historical white cities in the United States. His second book, Black Mayors, White Majorities, The Balancing Act of the Racial Politics, focuses on the challenges black mayors face in representing black interests in majority white, medium-sized cities in the state of Ohio. His third book, published with his mother, The Little Rock Crisis, What Desegregation Politics Says About Us, frames the story of the Little Rock 1957 desegregation crisis through the lens of memory. Not on the bio. If you follow Ravi, go ahead, Ravi. He's a very good Twitter follow. It's a lot of politics, but sometimes he sprinkles in very, very poignant, very, very interesting discussions about his faith and his faith journey. And so I appreciate that. He's also a good Kappa man. So, welcome, Ravi.
Absolutely. Always a good Kappa man. It is really good to be here, and I cannot thank Dr. Walker enough for this invitation, for this opportunity to really share with you one of my favorite perspectives of Reverend Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, and that is really a reflection on what he did not say. And I wanted to share with you my thoughts on the implications of this as it relates to the LGBTQ community and the current efforts going on in churches throughout the country to encourage more inclusion in those spaces. There was a time in which Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. actually expressed a very hostile attitude toward homosexuality. He obviously, of course, also there in New York said in 1950, he wrote an article in Ebony decrying homosexuality, and he said this directly. He called individuals parading homosexuals in churches and believed that young people were becoming more and more vulnerable to the horrible no man's land of sex. And he also believed that if a church took up a sex education program, that it would decrease homosexuality and homosexual potentiality in its membership and in its community. And rather than cast out gays and lesbians, Powell has argued that churches should draw homosexuals in to cure them. However, there appears to be no statements similar to Powell's among the litany of sermons from Reverend Dr. Wyatt T. Walker and others. And the argument I want to make today is that the relative silence in an era of blatant and rampant homophobia was the kind of embrace that allowed those individuals who felt othered in nearly every other ecumenical space to find home in a space in which at least that identity was not the predominant focus of the religious narrative they heard from the pulpit. And that, for many, saved their lives and brought them closer to God as a result. Here's how we know this happened. There's a lot that's been written, of course, about the relationships between Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Walter T. Wyatt and, of course, Bayard Rustin. Some scholars have argued that both of those individuals were his quote-unquote right-hand men, King's quote-unquote right-hand men. And what's interesting about this story is the interrelatedness of their relationships as friends and as colleagues on the battlefield, who met at different points, of course, in their respective histories, and yet they also shared a different kind of orientation to religious faith and its role in achieving justice for all. For example, Bayard Rustin deviated between almost agnosticism to being a member of the AME Church, to simply not believing that the church alone was the foundation in which you could achieve these goals. Whereas obviously we know that King and Wyatt in particular were focused on the moral reasons of human dignity that made their approach to civil rights that much more religiously oriented. I share this story, and I'm going to provide some quotes for evidence because there's been very little research done that is actually evidentiary based that suggests whether or not civil rights leaders, and particularly civil rights religious leaders like Walker, were in fact homophobic. There's a lot of suggestions in civil rights text that implicates a feeling of homophobia, and none of them are backed up with actual evidence. For example, from sermons, or from interviews, or from engagements with community groups in negative ways. There seems to be in many historical texts or historiographies, as a historian who's written a dissertation on this topic, Jordan Lighton, has indicated, there's this implicit assumption, even among historians in many ways, that there was this kind of latent level of undercurrent of homophobia in the same kinds of black churches where you had civil rights leaders like Walker leading them. And what is interesting is that when you actually look at the evidence, that is in fact not the case. And I wanted to highlight how we know that. So, for example, in 1964, there was a presidential aide who was brought up on moral charges. And his name was Walter Jenkins. And he was arrested. Because, of course, active homosexual activity, if caught, was a crime in the United States everywhere at that time. And it became an issue in the civil rights movement. And this was the final year that Walker was the executive director of the SCLC. And 40 prominent Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish religious leaders created an emergency committee. And at a press conference, joined by other leaders, the leaders of this emergency committee, of which Walker was a member, opposed the use of Jenkins as a campaign issue to be added to further civil rights causes. They said, quote, that the case and a few other episodes involving personal morality had been allowed to obscure fateful moral issues related to public life, such as civil rights, poverty, and the danger of nuclear war. And Wyatt T. Walker signed the document, was one of the 40 who did so, and was among the closest to Dr. King and, of course, to Bayard Rustin. Here's why this is unique. If you study the friendships between the three of them, has been told in history that Dr. King, for example, was introduced to Gandhi and nonviolent protests by Bayard Rustin. And Wyatt T. Walker was introduced to a kind of beloved community that was embraced by Dr. King, who he learned that term from another theologian while he was in seminary. And it shows how relationships between friends who have a shared agreement in human dignity and the inclusion of all can create space for other people who in every other location of religious identity is being excluded. What was going on in 1960 was a major period, of course. You had the March on Washington, which we know the significant role that played in American history. We also know that there was no one who spoke on that stage who was, in fact, a member of the LGBTQ community, and they were explicitly denied from doing so. And 20 years later, when they had a march in D.C. Commemorating, and Audre Lorde spoke there, she highlighted how she was in the audience at the March on Washington and how hearing just what Dr. King had to say changed her own life and made her witness her own sexual identity and orientation in ways in relationship to her engagement with civil rights. This time period was a period in which the black leadership brass, of which Walker was among them, was tolerant of those who were different and who were perceived by so many others as objectionable to Christianity. Remember that this is the same, right, Walker and other Baptist ministers that were, as a result of an election effort to try to have Dr. King made president of the National Baptist Convention, of course, led to the development of the Progressive Baptist Convention, which lists, particularly today, among its core priority areas of engaging all people, including LGBTQ persons. Quote, for example, the Progressive Baptist Convention had a schism in their creation in which an individual actually passed. And because of that relationship, they went and created a Progressive Baptist Convention that included all people. People's relationships to faith and their sexuality was important to their engagement with the civil rights cause. And what's amazing about the experience of African Americans in the civil rights movement is that many of them were, in fact, active in the same movement of which Walker was leading. And so groundwork is laid, I argue, as a result of Walker and others not being explicitly homophobic and embracing others and focusing on race and focusing on their shared commonality that allowed people to in fact, go into a space where they finally felt at home. Walker, Rustin, and others in the movement, some others known and others well less known, contribute significantly, I argue, in that even though their approach or acceptance or not of religion and their level of involvement in the movement varied, the common thread that binded them together was a commitment to the universal acceptance of the entirety of the human condition. Often, the power of non-decision making is just as powerful as decisions, particularly in politics. And simply, I argue that the power of Wyatt and other religious leaders to not use their pulpits to preach fire and brimstone to gays sent shockwaves, though subtle, to the faith of Christianity and to the various social justice movements, forcing many, and eventually perhaps the entirety of the institutions themselves, to finally and publicly confront these matters as it relates to their own policies. While I say we should not celebrate the actual silence of Walker on affirming LGBTQ specifically and directly and with clarity in those individuals, I do believe that we should embrace the influence that he and his friends had on various points of entry with the movement and the church and broadening the tent to be more inclusive of all. The movement and the Christian Black church was made better by their friendships that crossed state lines, that transcended borders and regions, and that introduced church leaders to nonviolence, introduced activists to church, and introduced both to their common cause of political action in their own interest. This is unique given, I believe, as I started, right, that you had the predominance of African American preachers, like people like Adam Clayton Powell at the time, who were speaking very abrasively and publicly and negatively about the homosexual community. And meanwhile, you had religious leaders like Walker, who instead chose to embrace the true vision of a beloved community that did, at the very least, include speaking not harm on those people who were, in fact, homosexual. And that was a unique and a challenging position, I believe, for him, in the fact that it was not common, as most black preachers, including there in Harlem, had a completely different orientation to this issue. Finally, what I want to say is that the triple evils, that the King Center talks about of poverty, racism, and militarism, and the overall focus of this of race, I believe was the large mission upon which Walker tried to follow throughout his career. While simply by not speaking negatively about homosexuals, more people were welcomed into the church and found the church to be home. Meanwhile, you had 70-80% of African Americans in survey and polling data indicate very negative attitudes toward homosexuals, which is why the choice to say nothing was a very powerful, or say very little and to never denigrate was a very powerful choice on his behalf, and that was consistent over decades. And because of his role also as being a political advisor to Governor Rockefeller on urban issues, when HIV and AIDS hit Harlem, and we should remember that the first patients who were made positive and were diagnosed, 20% of them were black, which was already a disproportionate number, right? Given that black folks at the time were only like 11% of the population. In his role as an advisor on urban affairs, he played a key role in helping the government to improve and increase their responsiveness on HIV and AIDS in the 80s and 90s there in New York. And that saved thousands of lives. And I submit this, and I would love to have the opportunity to discuss about it in question and answer, because there's a lot of evidence out there from interviews, particularly oral interviews, that have been conducted that show how civil rights leaders and civil rights activists and average everyday African Americans who were LGBTQ found comfort in continuing their participation in the movement because they heard from the voices of folks like Walker and King and Rustin, whose message to them toward inclusion did not inadvertently exclude them by preaching a fire and brimstone message such as, you are going to hell. I want to emphasize how important that is for the development of the current day efforts you see in churches everywhere that are expanding LGBTQ rights. I make the argument that had it not been for people who have chosen to stay in churches, and they chose to stay because people like Walker at least did not preach their death and destruction, and that because of that they found a home, and then they built community, and then because of that effort they stayed in those churches and helped those churches grow HIV and AIDS ministries eventually over the several decades, helped those churches grow and develop poverty programs and health programs, and to the current day, I believe, in particular, the role that Walker played in helping with decreasing the HIV and AIDS epidemic in New York, and the role in which they played in actually making church a place of social justice inclusion, where people's lives were literally saved and changed, and were not just preached at, talking about the afterlife. This is very important because many in the black church community, of course, were members of the kinds of congregations that talked about tomorrow and did less about the people in those pews who are living in those churches today. And Walker shines as, I think, a beacon of light of the kind of civil rights leader who used this message of relative silence, to be fair to him, but the kind of silence that at the time spoke volumes because it was interpreted for many as a level of acceptance where you can come here and be treated normally as the human being that you are. As a result, there is a corollary, I think, in timelines where opinion toward LGBTQ issues flipped, went from 70% negative to 70% in favor. And the proliferation of churches, according to the Duke Congregational Study, that engage LGBTQ issues, that are African American and Protestant, and that are Baptist, have increased significantly. And the argument I think that is so key here is that the folks who are doing that work today, I don't believe would have the power to think that it's possible to achieve if it weren't for the generation that came before them, that still found church as a space that welcomed all, not just some black people, not just the middle class, not just straight individuals, not just those with fancy clothes or educated high degrees, but all people. And Walker represented that wherever he pastored. And even if he did not speak affirmatively and toward LGBTQ issues, he also did not speak in a denigrating way. And for that, I believe he held true to the message of beloved community, and he helped save in New York, particularly in the height of the HIV and AIDS epidemic, thousands of black lives. And for that, we should all be grateful.
I believe we may have time for one question. Okay, all right. Questions from the audience? All right, then I'll ask mine. Reverend Wills and Ravi. Oh, okay, all right. Yes, ma'am. No.
Appreciate that. So, how am I materializing the efficacy of silence as it relates to Wyatt Walker's engagement with LGBTQ issues? Is that a fair re-articulation? Yes, yes, yes. Because of and particularly because of the ethos of truth-telling. So here's the challenge: we don't have to date any recordings of sermons at length that, at least that I have been able to find in the research that I have done in archives, where he explicitly referenced LGBTQ people, right, in Sunday morning pulpits. And I juxtapose that, right, to people like Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, who wasn't only doing that in a religious context in terms of his beliefs as a pastor, but was also using the power of his position to make those arguments in magazines like Ebony that, of course, had a wide distribution throughout the black community. And so I'm juxtaposing the explicit harm of people like Adam Clayton Powell versus the, which I might call the loving silence of embrace that, given the 70% or so of black folks at the time, according to polls, that were homophobic, that did have homophobic views, the suggestion is that silence is perhaps the first step toward the moderation that led to the progressive engagement, particularly inside mainstream churches today, of black LGBTQ people to create more space for their inclusion. For example, as a black LGBTQ person myself, who a member of the AME Church, I could have chosen, because of my own activism, to leave, right, the AME Church and go to a different one. But instead, because I have been engaged in places where there was not direct messages that were homophobic, that provided a little bit slither of space to continue to believe that working in those environments, or in other words, working from within, was still something that we could do. And my argument is that generationally, from the 60s, there's a litany of African Americans involved in the civil rights movement who were LGBTQ, who were religious, because of course 90% of African Americans identified as Christian, particularly at that time. And yet they were mostly not in spaces, right, where they could exercise those beliefs openly in their churches. And so to have those pastors, the very few, like Walker at the time, to speak a different message of inclusion that may not have explicitly targeted LGBTQ people, but was universal, and therefore, and by not being explicitly homophobic, created space for those generations of folks to say, hey, I can still participate in this. He was, as an example, part of the effort to break away from the National Baptist Convention that was, and some would argue still to this day, very homophobic, that led to the PGA, the PBA, the Progressive Baptist Association, that Dr. King, of course, was the original leader of. And the suggestion is that while the LGBTQ issue was not, fresh off their lips, right, on the litany of groups, I think the message is that they were less, Walker in particular, was less focused on naming of the individual identity that may be subjugated, but creating a space for everyone to actually be included. And I think it's some of a dovetail as well to why he was against critical race studies and those types of efforts, and that it was a broader vision, and it was broad, and because it was broad, and that broadness included silence toward LGBTQ issues when every other church, proverbial church in the block, was preaching death and hell. And that alone created space for people to stay, work from within, and the argument is decades later, their children and their children have stayed and working in spaces that are less than perfect, and are now, we see in the AME Church, in the United Methodist Church, in the Episcopal Church, in the Catholic Church, often led by African Americans that are queer who decide to stay. And I think many of them were encouraged by people like Walker, who were their pastors for decades, and who preached love as opposed to some identity significance that limited your love to your race. Yes. Well, publicly he was. Yes. Right. So so I don't disagree with that. So I don't disagree with that. My response would be, and I love Kathy Cohen. We share the same hometown, and she's lovely. And I teach boundaries of blackness. My response simply would be that the one, I'm talking about a different era. I'm talking about largely the 70s and 80s. Much of Kathy Cohen's work was in the 80s and 90s in terms of that book in particular, just to be narrow in terms of that particular text. And so it was a different era. And the Walker connection here for me is that his choice to be inclusive of all people was a first step in an era which, again, 70% of people was against homophobia, like vehemently against homophobia. Like they weren't like passive about it. And that was the first step toward moderation that has increased over time. So I guess you could say I'm making a pragmatic progressive argument or incrementalism argument, that it began with folks like Walker who had ties to politics and politicians and advised them all the time. And I have to believe that advising that included, getting more funding for HIV and AIDS in black communities like Harlem in the 80s and 90s, and getting them to pay attention to that when you had a president who did nothing for a decade, and President Reagan, make those types of efforts were powerful for what they were at the time. But no, I'm not suggesting that it, of course, was right in that it was complete. No, I want to highlight that I don't think silence is something that is a good thing. Certainly not making that argument. But in the late 1960s and 1970s, that actually wasn't a bad deal. But I'll give one example, and I'll shut up. Pauli Murray wrote a letter to Barrett Rustin complaining about why she was not going to participate in the March on Washington.
You never said Rustin was gay.
Oh, yeah. Barrett Rustin's gay. He was married later with a guy he met who then ended up graduating and going to Howard. But nonetheless, Murray wrote a letter complaining about why would she participate in a march, right, that excluded people like her, LGBTQ women, from the dais. And the response essentially was, right, an argument of pragmatism, that given the winds of the day, this is the decision that we made. And you see this in letters and friendships, which I explain in the paper, in letters between them and their friendships expressed. You see a thread of a beloved community that they clearly had for each other and for LGBTQ people, but there was a political understanding that in order to actually make progress on this issue and not go back several steps, that perhaps the best route here is to speak inclusion of all people, and because we aren't excluding anyone, that in and of itself was a powerful expansion, I would argue, of the boundaries of blackness at the time. Controversy.
We will take a 1 hour break from here for lunch. For those of you who are here visiting the University of Richmond, our dining hall is right across the street, and you can go grab a lunch over there, and we will reconvene at 1 o'clock p.m. for our third conversation. So we look forward to seeing everybody again at 1.